10 of them were. So Article 1 and Article 2 of the original proposals were not ratified in 1791. So the Bill of Rights, now if you go to the National Archives, or I think it's National Archives, I could be wrong on that. The document that's on display there as the Bill of Rights has 12 articles in it. Most people don't bother to count and realize that 2 of them at that time were not ratified. Now I'll tell you, I'll save my angered college boy story and return to that about how number 2 eventually became number 27, which you would have thought after all those years, but the National Archivist said, no, it's still live. No time limit was put on it. Oh. And how an angry college student, we'll talk about that angry college student on our last session. Quick review of what we did the first session. Yeah. We talked about the 7 principles of our Constitution: popular sovereignty, the people rule, limited government, the government is not all powerful, separation of powers. We have a legislative, executive, and judicial unit. Checks and balances, that each of those power has authority and power over the other 2 branches, to check them, except for the judicial branch, which has no power of enforcement. So that's the weakness of the judicial branch. Federalism, that the powers of government are divided between the states and the national government. And as long as the state law does not conflict with the Constitution, state law is the law of the land. And so the irony is, as you will talk about ratifying the Constitution, is those who became the Federalists stole on their opponents, because those people that called themselves Federalists were anti-Federalists. But Alexander Hamilton and James Madison grabbed the name Federalist and ran with it. So now you have the anti-Federalists opposed to what they actually represent. And they're going, what do we call ourselves? But anti-Federalist is no great game, but that's what happened. So we'll talk about how that happened and how that worked out. And then republicanism, that we are a republic. We vote, we are not a pure democracy, but we are a democracy in that we elect people to represent us, and hopefully we elect wise people to represent us. Now that, of course, hasn't worked out all that well. And as far as the founders were concerned, they did not see this as a lifetime job. This is for the House of Representatives, serve one term as a responsibility of being a good citizen, and then somebody else can serve. Over the years, obviously that's changed. Mm-hmm. So, and then finally, the rule of law. So you look at the words on the Supreme Court building, equal justice under law, which is not terribly meaningful right at the moment. So, and that's what I used to try and get my students. I had to read an article on John Locke, and I'd say, I can summarize that article in 4 words. And then they would debate and argue back and forth and and then they would finally say, Dr. Peet, what is it? I said, equal justice under law is what John Locke was talking about. Nobody is any better than anybody else as far as the law is concerned, and that's critical. Then I talked about the idea that our founders at the Constitutional Convention did not invent this out of the ether. They had been exposed to English law, which was critical, the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the Petition of Rights, Acts of Parliament, common law, all those things that we take. Are we good, George? Oh, get over closer to the microphone.
It is in front of the camera.
Oh, and in front of the camera. Okay. And where else did they get these ideas from? From the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the philosophers. So to Thomas Hobbes, the idea of a social contract, that people willingly gave up some of their rights and freedoms for protection and order. from the Baron de Montesquieu, the idea itself of the separation of powers, legislative, judicial, executive. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the name for the social contract, and that the contract must be written. Because there is an English Bill of Rights, but nobody knows exactly what it is. Because it's a combination of the Magna Carta, Petition of Right, English Bill of Rights, Act of Parliament, Common Law. So where are your protections written down? Well, they're not. Voltaire, the importance of the freedom of speech. I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And then John Locke, that the purpose of government was understanding the law of nature, and that the purpose of the state was to protect life, liberty, and property, not pursuit of happiness. So what happened? So we've got to start, how did we get from these 13 colonies without a constitution, who didn't like each other all that much, who didn't cooperate very well, to combining together and revolting against England, and then developing our first concept, a Declaration of Independence, then our first Constitution, which is where we will end today, which was known as the Articles of Confederation. So what happened? Well, during the period of time from the petition of the English Civil War to the end of the French and Indian War, which was 1763, the colonies for about a 60-year period of time were left on their own. That was called salutary neglect. And also what happened was the idea that Britain did not like the colonists shipping their goods, carrying goods on their ships and making a profit on those. The profit needed to, as far as England was concerned, needed to go to the English government. They mandated that in the Navigation Acts. But during the period of salutary neglect, not only were the colonies on their own, not only did they learn to govern themselves, they also made a huge profit on shipping of molasses and items that were often used. So, political independence for the colonies. They learned to be independent. They learned to govern themselves. They learned through their legislators to make laws that were appropriate to their needs and their situation. Now, most people don't know this, but George Washington started the French and Indian War all by himself, by not very good leadership, not wise leadership at that time. I can honestly say George Washington is a perfect example of somebody who grew over time, who actually learned from his mistakes, and ultimately became the chief strategist of the Revolutionary War, knowing one thing. He said, it's not about Boston. It's not about New York. It's not about Philadelphia. It's not about any of those cities. It's about keeping my army together. If I can keep my army together, I can win this thing. I will wear the British out. And then we don't want to forget that France provided us with a good deal of help as well. So we have that. So the English, England wins this world war with the French and the Spanish, but they incur a huge war debt. Considering that George Washington was essential in starting this war, their thinking was, well, the colonists should pay for part of it. And you know what? That's a very legitimate thing. The only problem was that Parliament didn't ask the colonists whether they explain to them that, hey, we fought this very expensive war. We've got a huge war debt. You're partly responsible for it. We would like you to help pay for it. I think if they had gone to the colonists and to their legislatures and explained everything, the colonists would say, yeah, okay, that's a good point, but they didn't. So we have then a chief, I forget which tribe he belonged to, but his name was Pontiac, who on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains began attacking and sacking colonies. It was serious business. And Britain said, we can't possibly protect colonists on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. We don't have the resources to do that. Therefore, you can't settle there. And the colonists are going, what do you mean we can't settle? That's what we fought this whole freaking war for, was to be able to settle on that side. So, because if we have to stay on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, a lot of the good land is already taken. And by a propertied elite, of which George Washington, by the way, was one, just FYI. So England issued that proclamation of 1863 and angered the colonists. Now, the next series of things that we're going to see might lead you to believe that the American Revolution was conducted for purely economic purposes. And even though I'm going to talk about 1864, 1865, 1866, 1867, 1870, 1770, 1773, with taxes that are proposed, you would get the wrong idea. So I want you to know that these are the triggers, these are the things that really bothered the colonists, but that were not, even though they are a direct cause, did not make the American Revolution an economic war. It was a war of principle. So we start out with the Sugar Act, set a duty. Let me flip here so I can follow. They put a duty on foreign sugar and molasses, and also mandated that that couldn't be brought into the colonies on anything but British shipping, going back to the net, enforcing the Navigation Act. Well, colonial merchants, ship owners, and rum distillers, that's what the molasses was used for. And in fact, rum was almost the currency of that particular time period. The rum was distinctly worth a lot of money. So the colonists rise up in anger over this. And as if that wasn't enough, the very next year, so we started out 1764, now 1765, the protests were strong and violent. So that's something we want to think about. The Stamp Act was far more sweeping than the Sugar Act. It levied a tax on all printed matter, newspapers, advertisements, playing cards, legal documents. The colonists vigorously protest. Merchants sign non-importation agreements. 9 colonies get together and form what's called the Stamp Act Congress in protest, which of course was a huge step along the road to the colonies acting collectively to defend themselves. And so Parliament blows them off, says you can't do any, you're not going to have any effect. Actually, it was very effective. It just pretty much shut down that type of trade. So England is not making any money. And so Parliament, and notice I'm going to have to make a distinction between King George III, because the colonists will say, well, we support King George III, but we're angry at Parliament. And we want King George III to be the good father that he is for us and overrule Parliament. Well, as the Stamp Act Congress would find out, yeah, they succeeded in this. And so Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But we can't forget the Quartering Act of 1765, where Parliament declared that we can force you to house ours and feed our soldiers in your homes. So if you've ever looked at your pocket constitution and you go to the Bill of Rights, you will see the Third Amendment is there shall be no quartering. Where did that come from? It came from this. It was very meaningful. This was a big point of contention. So that leads to the Third Amendment. But what the colonists in their celebration of the repeal of the Stamp Act missed was this little thing called the Declaratory Act of 1766, in which Parliament said, we have full authority to do basically whatever we want with you. We can pass laws whether you like them or not. We can tax you whether you like it or not. So it left the issue of exactly what type of control Parliament had over the colonies completely in limbo. Then we get to the Townshend Acts, named for Champagne Charlie Townshend. And this was even more, and they're trying to figure out, well, what are the colonists really upset about? In this case, they placed duties on tea, lead, glass, dyes for paint, wrongly believing that it was where the tax was being collected that was the problem. So if we collect it and not from these agents that we're sending around, if we collect it, automatically, well, the colonists aren't even going to realize that was happening. Well, the Massachusetts legislature quickly figured that out and came up with the idea of taxation without representation. Now, I've got a drawing there. This is a little bit farther on this. That is the Boston Tea Party. And that happened in 1763. So we're a little far, we're 1773. And that, so I may come back to that particular photograph because we have reached that. The protests were once again very effective. And this would lead to a very unfortunate event called the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre was one of the greatest pieces of propaganda ever perpetrated on Americans by Americans. In other words, you might not think 5 people being killed is a massacre, but thanks to Paul Revere, who not only made the Midnight Ride, and I should say part of the Midnight Ride, because he was captured. Most people, if you read Longfellow's poem, you wouldn't understand. He never made it to the end. He didn't make it all that far, actually. What happens is the English, because of the uproar, the British bring 2 units of troops into Boston. And of course, they've already passed the Quartering Act. And now the citizens of Boston have to house those soldiers that they detect in their homes. And so on February 22nd, 11-year-old Christopher Sider was shot and killed by a Boston businessman, Ebenezer Richardson, a known informer, who was, because he was trying to take down a boycott protest sign, a large hand with the word importer, off of one of his friends' businesses. Brawls between the soldiers and the rope makers break out on March 2nd and the 3rd. They escalate. It starts with a fist fight between one rope maker and a British soldier. The rope maker bests the British soldier. So the soldier goes back whining and complaining, and more soldiers show up. And so ultimately it escalates over time. So in this case, what actually happened? Let me go to my correct documents. So the soldiers, these soldiers who are not trained for crowd control or any type of fighting against civilians, basically don't know what to do. So the colonists have one story, the British have another story, and so you kind of got to distinguish between the 2 of them. So it said, the mob, so let's take a look at the British side of the story from Captain Preston. The mob still increased and were more outrageous, striking their clubs or bludgeons against one another and calling out, "Come out, you rascals, you bloody back, you lobster scoundrels, you lobster sons of bitches. Come out, goddamn you, fire and be damned. We know you dare not." And much more such language was used. At this time, I was between the soldiers and the mob, parleying with and endeavoring all in my power to persuade them to retire peaceably, but to no purpose. They advanced to the point of the bayonets, struck some of them and even the muzzles of the pieces, and seemed endeavoring to close with the soldiers. On which some well-behaved persons asked me if the guns were loaded. I replied, yes. Then they asked me if I intended to order the men to fire. I said, no, by no means, observing that I was standing before the muzzles of the men's pieces and must fall a sacrifice if they fired, that the soldiers were upon half-cock and charged bayonets, and my giving the word to fire under those circumstances would prove me to be no officer. The whole of this melancholy affair was transacted in almost 20 minutes. On my asking the soldiers why they fired without orders, they said they heard the word fire and supposed it came from me. This might be the case, as many of the mob called out, "Fire, fire." But I assured the men I gave no such order. My words were, "Don't fire. Don't fire. Stop your firing. And so the soldiers heard what they wanted. Now, the other side is these assailants, that's the soldiers, who issued from Murray's barracks after attacking and wounding diverse persons in Cornhill, as above mentioned. Being armed, proceeded, most of them, up the Royal Exchange Lane onto King Street, where making a short stop, and after assaulting and driving away the few they met there, they brandished their arms and cried out, "Where are the boogers? Where are the cowards?" And then Captain Preston is said to have ordered them to fire and to have repeated that order. One gun was fired first, then others in succession and with deliberation, till 10 or a dozen guns were fired, or till that number of discharges were made from the guns that were fired, by which means 11 persons were killed and wounded, as represented above. So the great piece of propaganda is this picture right here. So if you go to Boston, the Royal Exchange, I don't know if that puts an arrow over it. No, it doesn't. The Royal Exchange building is still there, but the plaque where the people were shot is actually out in the middle of an intersection. So you got this little island in Boston you got to walk out to, and there on that is the plaque that says, this is about, here's where Crispus Attucks and the others were shot and killed. But if you look carefully at the picture, you look at the British. Brilliant red uniforms. Those colonists were just, we want to kill them. And then on the other side, you see that little dog is even there. These mean British soldiers. And there's a woman with her hands like this saying, oh, what a horrible thing. And of course, they're dressed very poorly and raggedly. So you have the brilliantly dressed soldiers. And of course, if you could read the hall, it says Butcher's Hall on the one. So all this is to show that this was intentional on the part of the British. It was no accident. At least the colonists believe it was no accident. The truth is probably somewhere in between those, because among other things, the colonists, we were only throwing like snowballs, not even throwing them that hard, except that it was chunks of coal, broken glass, solid ice balls. It wasn't just a snowball. So yeah, it was a difficult situation. So in response to, we gotta walk back to the situation settling down. And in fact, future President John Adams represented the British soldiers, because he said, look, we represent something very unique to the world. We are going to demonstrate that it would be easy to convict these, but I'm not going to let that happen because we are better than the English from which we came. We truly believe in the rule of law. I'm going to make sure that to the best of my ability, these soldiers get a fair trial. And they did. All but two were, Captain Preston was acquitted separately in a trial. And then the other soldiers, all but two were acquitted. Two were found guilty of manslaughter. But what happened was they were branded on their thumbs with a mark that indicated if they ever came back and broke that law again, they would be executed. But temporarily, so it was painful to be branded, but the fact is they escaped with their lives. Thanks to John Adams, who in 1815 said, people still are mad at me. This is over 50 years later. They're still mad at me because they think I am not one of their countrymen, that I'm a traitor to the country because I wanted to make sure that the rule of law really meant something here in the colonies. So now we go to 1773, the Tea Act, which goes back to the picture we saw earlier. So in this case, the English East India Company was failing. They were going bankrupt. So what Parliament does is they said the company can bypass wholesalers and sell directly to American agents, which resulted in lower than ever tea prices in the colonies. So they said, how can the colonists possibly, who drank tea and loved tea, how can they complain about tea? Because now it's cheaper than ever. But the colonists saw through that. They realized, hey, this is a monopoly, and they refused to buy the tea. So it's at this moment where you see Americans shift from being tea drinkers to coffee drinkers. So in this one event, and in fact, 342 chests of tea are dumped overboard from 3 ships by Mohawk Indians, white Mohawk Indians, yeah. And that was 90,000 pounds of tea overboard into the Boston Harbor. And when they do core samples of Boston Harbor and you get down to where the tea was dumped overboard, you find the dark brown layer there that's still there after these centuries. And so you can get it in core samples and still find out about it. So the actual blend of tea that was used and thrown overboard was a mixture of Ceylon and Darjeeling teas from Sri Lanka and India. It can still be purchased from the original shippers, Davis and Newman of London. The label says, this tea is from the same London blending house, which in the year of our Lord, 1773, had the misfortune to suffer a grievous wrong, and that certain persons did place a quantity of our finest produce in the Boston Harbor. Now, as to taxation without representation, William Pitt, former prime minister, said that, speaking in the Commons, said this: "It is my opinion that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. The Commons of America, the colonial assemblies, have never been in possession of their constitutional rights of giving and granting their own money. At the same, this kingdom has always bound the colonies by her laws, her regulations, and everything except that of their money out of their pockets without their consent. Here I would draw the line." So, of course, England was pretty angry about, 90,000 pounds of tea, which, by the way, Boston did pay for the original value, but somewhere around 1976, I think, that they actually paid for the tea that was dumped overboard, but it was a pittance by that time. But they could say, yeah, we actually did pay for it. So, but what the Parliament does now, they are very angry. They pass what are called the Intolerable Acts. So now 1773, so 1764, 1765, 1766, 1767, 1770, 1773. You see, as far as the colonists are looking at it, this is a never-ending procession of taxes that we can't vote upon. So they closed the Boston port until the tea was paid for, which is why I brought up that they eventually did pay for it. Town meetings were forbidden because those were dangerous. Those were sources of insurrection. Royal officials charged with crimes would no longer be tried in the colonies, but tried in England, where of course they're going to get a favorable jury, and nobody, if a jury at all, or if a trial at all. And a new quartering act was passed, forcing local officials to provide food and housing for British soldiers in private homes if necessary. And the effect was unanticipated by Parliament. They thought that we can divide Massachusetts and those rabble rousers away from all the other colonies. The other colonies aren't going to care, but they did care. And so then comes one that was a right-hand curveball, 1774, the Quebec Act. Well, why does that make a difference? What England said is the boundary lines between the North America and Canadian North America was now the Ohio River. So north of the Ohio River, Ohio, Indiana, what would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, all part of Canada. And not only that, that they gave full rights to French Canadian Catholics. And of course, if you know anything about the colonists, they were rabidly anti-Catholic, very suspicious. And so this just sets them aflame. So that leads to the First Continental Congress, 1770, so Quebec Act. Now, 1774, the First Continental Congress. The Parliament cannot believe that the colonies are willing to cooperate with each other, but they do. They sent an entreaty to the King George III, thinking that the problem is Parliament, but George III says, leave me alone, you peasants. I don't want anything to do with this. So they passed the Declaration of Resolves, which called for a boycott of British goods, which Parliament said, oh, they can't possibly carry that out. And it turns out they did, and it was 97% effective in the boycott. So it's a collapse of income from the colonies during this time. And then the First Continental Congress says, we're probably not going to get any justice. So let's propose that we meet again in May of 1775, which by that time we're past April the 18th and April the 19th of Concord and Lexington. So the Revolutionary War in effect has already begun. So Second Continental Congress convenes. George Washington is appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army on June the 19th, 1775. On June the 7th, 1775, Henry Lee proposes his resolution of independence. They will debate that for some time. So here we are in 1775, very early on. Then in June the 11th, 1775, Congress appoints a committee to write the Articles of Confederation. So they're already thinking along the lines of a written constitution. On the same day, they create a committee of 5 whose purpose is to write the Declaration of Independence. And so you're going to see that the debate on independence itself goes from June the 7th to July the 2nd of the same year. And at the same day, and the committee to write the Declaration of Independence consists of 5 men: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Adams later wrote about why Jefferson was chosen. He says, reason first, you are a Virginian. And Parliament needs to realize, and the other colonies need to realize, we are together on this. So we are cooperating with each other. And a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, which was true. I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. Right on all 3 counts. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can write. And that was also true. So the primary, but not sole author of the Declaration of Independence was indeed Thomas Jefferson. But all the members of this committee contributed to writing the draft, and all of them were included in the debates in Congress that made some significant changes to the document. So the Declaration consists of an introduction, a preamble, that's the most famous part, a list of indictments of George III, which we will come back to, because that's the part that used to bore me in the Declaration of Independence. But it turns out that it was far more important than I had given it credit for being. And I will read you some of those here shortly. So that was important. So the editorial changes that Continental Congress made were almost all for the better. They improved the document that Jefferson had drafted, but he refused. He would every change that was made. Benjamin Franklin was watching Jefferson. He's going, "That guy's pretty thin-skinned about this." And everything, no matter how much it improved it, Jefferson got angrier and angrier and angrier. So about 1/4 of the draft was dumped. And Jefferson was so upset about that, he hand wrote out copies of his original, hand wrote out a number, and sent it to his friends saying, I want you to compare the final document with what I wrote. Don't you agree that what I wrote was better? And in fact, Continental Congress really approved upon Jefferson's document. He just didn't want to admit it. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a very, very observant guy, and he probably understood human nature about as well as anybody. So the more alterations Congress made on his draft, the more miserable Jefferson became. He had forgotten, as has posterity, that a draftsman is not an author, and that the Declaration of Independence, as Congress sometimes called it, was not a novel or a poem or even a political essay presented to the world as the work of a particular writer, but a public document, an authenticated expression of the American mind. Franklin, who was sitting nearby, perceived that I was not insensible to these mutilations, Jefferson later recalled, and attempted to console him with the story of a young hatter about to open his own shop, who proposed to have a fine signboard made with the words, "John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hat for ready money," and the figure of a hat. So first, however, Thompson asked his friends for their advice. One proposed taking out hatter since it was redundant with makes hats. Another recommended that makes be removed since customers wouldn't exactly care who made the hats. A third said for ready money was unnecessary since it was not the local custom to sell on credit. Sell hats. A fourth commented, did Thompson suppose people thought he meant to give them away? It was not a local custom either. In the end, the sign said simply, John Thompson, with a picture of a hat, which probably served its function quite well. Franklin said, however, he had learned from that anecdote to avoid whatever in my power becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body. Did Franklin understand how much Congress, like the relentless editors in his story, was practicing a technique that Jefferson himself had used to good effect when he took Mason's language and compressed George Mason, who was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which Jefferson borrowed from freely until it gained power far more than it lost in length. So you get the idea this document, this wonderful document, did not immediately become, by the way, this comes from American Scripture by Pauline Maier, which is a wonderful book, the best of the many, many, many volumes on the creation of the Declaration of Independence. This is the best one. Now let's talk about that section, the laundry list that was an issue. What were some of the complaints against the king? He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new officers and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. For depriving, in many cases, the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses. So you see some of the things that we see that the colonists were upset about King George III seem to apply equally to the situation that we're watching evolve right as we speak. So, but the key is, when did the Declaration of Independence become this revered document? And not immediately. Why? Because it was independence that was the key idea that they were concerned about. That's what they celebrated, because even on the wrong day, as far as John Adams was concerned, because they unanimously voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776. And John Adams said something to the effect, this is the day that will go down in history. We're going to celebrate it with fireworks and cheering and public meetings. And it didn't happen. Why it evolved, nobody exactly knows why it evolved to the 4th, other than the in Congress, July 4th, 1776. And that's what became known rather than the actual Declaration of Independence itself. And you will notice that George Washington never signed it. Why? He was the general leading the troops out in the field during all these debates. So on the same day that the Committee of Five was created, a committee to draft the Articles of Confederation. So they knew they are following.
Computers will shut off at 6 minutes before close. Please let staff know if you need assistance.
Okay, so the Articles of Confederation then would become our first constitution. The committee consisted of John Dickinson, Pennsylvania's the chairman. Now, I put the list there just so you could see who was involved. But one of the key players who gets, other than the Sam Adams beer, who is only known as a brewer, Sam Adams was probably the single most important revolutionary you know nothing about. And that's because he made sure that this was the guy that was running below the radar screen. If you're talking about the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, guess who was involved in that? Sam Adams. If you want to talk about the Boston Tea Party, guess who was the leader of that? Sam Adams. You walk down, Sam Adams has his fingerprints everywhere if you know where to look. And so and who was the colonist that the British most wanted to capture and most wanted to punish? Sam Adams, and they never got him. He was the master puppeteer in a way, pulling the strings. He was important in the town. If you look at every single major event in that early part of the revolutionary history, Sam Adams has his fingerprints on it. So critically important. So the committee's plan was submitted to Congress on July 12, 1776, and after long debates adopted on November 15, 1777, and then it sits until 1781. Debates and arguments. So it's passed, but it has to be unanimously ratified. And there are some states that hold out, Maryland in particular. Why? Because of the land claimed by Virginia and the eastern seaboard states on the western parts. Virginia not only claimed all of the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota. They claimed all of that. They also claimed Kentucky. So it's like almost everything level with their state geographic line that they claimed. Virginia had to give up one of the compromises ultimately that got Maryland, the last state, to ratify was that Virginia had to give up its claims. North Carolina gave up its claim to what later became Tennessee. Georgia gave up its claims to what later became Alabama, Mississippi. I'm missing something. Alabama, Mississippi. Well, Georgia's part, no, because Louisiana's out because that's French. So at that point, so I guess it is just Georgia. So gave up territory that would become Alabama and Mississippi. So once those eastern states agreed to do so, then Maryland said, okay, we'll sign on. And the Articles of Confederation becomes the Americans' first constitution. Now, it had a lot of flaws. It was tremendously weak. So there was an emphasis, of course, these are the 13 colonies. And so the emphasis was on the colonies over a national government. No executive. So yes, there was a president of Continental Congress, but he wasn't the head of state. And it was a term, 1-year term. So that's why when you see the Declaration of Independence, who was the president of Continental Congress? John Hancock. So we know that's the first signature that was put on. And then we don't know when it was put on, and we don't know when all the rest of the signatures were put on. We do know that the Declaration of Independence was not transmitted to the states until after January 1777. So no national judiciary. Who is to resolve differences between these 13 independent fiefdoms? In fact, France, after the American Revolution, said, do we send one diplomat or do we send 13? They were going to send 13 diplomats, one for each of the states. No ability for Congress to tax the states. All Congress could do is say, man, Virginia, we really do something. Get your pony up. And the states were horrible about doing that, which made it very difficult to provide food and supplies to the Continental Army. And if it wasn't for French assistance with General Rochambeau, who freely opened up his chest and gave the Americans money to help equip themselves, and for the sea power that the French provided, the United States could not possibly have won the American Revolution. Amending the Articles of Confederation required unanimity. That's the one thing that never happened in the Articles of Confederation Congress. They were never they had no unanimity about anything. So amending it, that which would have been required, was not going to happen, which becomes a critical factor when you look at how in the world that they managed to write a new constitution when the old one required that it be unanimously adopted. Passing a law required 9 states. So what, 2/3, 3/4? And so not very many laws were passed. And sometimes you get these one incredibly important law was what was known as the Northwest Ordinance. Coming from Ohio or Illinois or Indiana or Michigan or Wisconsin, you know the Northwest Ordinance because that was what was used to create these states. Now, in the case, you will notice, amazingly, slavery was prohibited in the Northwest Ordinance. Religious freedom was mandated in the Northwest Ordinance. Now, here's how it worked out. Normally, you would think, okay, the northern colonies voted to ban slavery, and the southern colonies voted to allow it. Not so. The southern colonies voted to ban slavery, and the northern colonies voted to allow it, and they were outvoted. Now you go, wait a minute. Why would Virginia didn't, they knew the land was good north of the Ohio. They felt that if slavery were allowed in Ohio, that territory would economically outcompete them rapidly because the soil in Virginia was exhausted. And the Northerners said, they voted to allow slavery because they said, well, who do you think is going to settle that area? You think Southerners are going to come here and say, no, it's going to be us. And we won't allow slavery. So that's why you have this odd dichotomy. Now, what about religious freedom? Well, some states did have state religions. Massachusetts was Congregationalist. Virginia was the Church of England, later the Episcopalian. So they had state religions. But in each case, the state religion thought, well, we're close enough. It'll be Lutherans. Lutherans are going to win anyway, or Methodists or Congregationalists, because guess who's going to settle there? Our religion's going to win. So we want to have religious freedom so that our religion can win. And so that's why that worked out. So even as incompetent as Continental Congress was, and inept and weak, they did accomplish some very good and important things. So important that one of the first acts of the new Congress would be to repass the Northwest Ordinance to make sure that it was adopted. How about standing? They didn't. What ability did they have to raise an army? Almost none. So how was the United States going to defend itself? That becomes a very important question. So in our next session, we're going to look at what's the crisis that came, what crises, multiple crises came up that forced them to get together and consider doing a new government that was impossible under the Articles of Confederation. So we will, in our next session, look at writing the Constitution of the United States, how it happened, how they managed to pull it off, and who was supremely important. And I'll give you a clue. If George Washington wasn't there at the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution would never have been ratified. It was George Washington's not only presence there, but the fact that he was the president of the Constitutional Convention was the stamp of approval that many people in the colonies, that's what they needed, because during the ratification process, as you will see, it was a very, very close thing, like one vote in the state of New York. Virginia was close, and the people that made Virginia's approval happen were what are now West Virginians. So it was the western counties of Virginia who didn't give a shit about slavery and they didn't like the institution. They resented the property elites. They had the votes that carried in the Virginia legislature that carried in their ratification convention that carried it.
So 5 minutes.
In
Please
spite,
bring all material forward for checkout.
in spite of the wonderfully eloquent Patrick Henry, who did not go to the Constitutional Convention because he said, "I smell a rat." So that's where we will stop for today, and I will happily open up to any and all questions you might have and answer them to the best of my ability. We don't have to run out of the building. Okay, I do have to make sure we shut the lights off, and they've locked the doors for us already. So we will just put the chairs back and shut everything. I have to turn off the lights in the restroom, turn off the light in the lobby, make sure the doors are not barred open, and we're good to go. So we can take as much time, and I will answer any questions to the best of my ability. If I don't know, I will tell you I don't know.
You've got us all mesmerized, dear. Great.
Yes, sir.
What were the first two Bill of Rights that were not accepted by the government?
The first one had to, number one, had to do with how redistricting would occur. And the numbers in it are meaningless today. That's why, and they were meaningless pretty quickly. And so the states realized, no, we're growing, we're going to get bigger. This is probably an unworkable process. The second one was that pay raises voted by Congress cannot go into effect in the session of Congress that voted for them. They can't vote themselves directly pay raises. You have to wait till the next Congress, till Congress is reelected, and then the pay raises go into effect. Yes, sir.
If you're recording, so you
Oh.
move back.
Sorry about that. Other questions? Anything is fair game. Well, thank you so much for your, yes,
Why did they decide on a republic?
they decided on a republic because this guy named James Madison had researched every single, and I do mean every single democratic form of government that had ever existed, at least that was written down. That's how thorough his research was. And no democracies survived. They were unworkable on a small scale, and they were totally unworkable on the large scale of the size of the 13 of the United States. So they had to come up with something different to allow to keep the democratic process, but it would be like anything that our country faced now, if everybody had to vote on it, think how unworkable that would be. That's what James Madison realized. That's why they proposed the idea. They had some republics. None of the republics had worked out all that well. They were like, Venice was called a republic, but it was an oligarchy, a council of 10. The leader of Venice, unfortunately, we call it Doge. How much more relevant could, and normally the Doge was like one of the oldest of the oligarchs, and he got to ride out on the first ship. If there was a warships approaching, he was out on the front of the first ship, so usually didn't survive. So nobody really wanted to be the Doge. So, but they realized the republic solved the problem of representing a large number of people, but representing their needs if they elected people who were properly qualified to represent them. and their interests, and who understood the importance of an education, of understanding the principles of government on which the Constitution was founded. And that has been pushed off to the wayside, unfortunately. They never intended congressmen to serve more than 1 or 2 terms. And it was your civic duty to do that. Yes, sir, Bill.
The library is now closed and will reopen tomorrow morning at 10. Have a great evening.
Oh, I lived down in California for many years, and we considered California to be pretty much a mob office. And it's, and my perspective of what I've seen recently is that because everybody got one of these things in their hand and they dive into the weeds of which they're not competent to make decisions on. And that's, I see it happening because of technology.
Well, that's something, I call it, it used to be Bill Clinton reveled in the information superhighway. I call it the misinformation super speedway. And so Lincoln and many others realized how very important an education was. And why you need to teach relevant information about the country, why that's very important. And that's something that's passed by the wayside over the last few years. So we have a lot to correct, but I'm not sure with everybody's. So now you have these ideological bubbles, and people only go to fact sites that support their particular outlook.
Yeah.
And one of the critical things, which I used to do with my students, is we have to look at all sides of an issue. And we have to agree upon what are facts. And if you can't agree upon what are facts, we're in serious trouble. And so we have this attack on expertise. We have an attack on fact. We have an attack on science. So we're in a world of hurt.
Well, it's fascinating because Wikipedia, their methodology of coming up with what goes in there is predicated upon, and they have people sitting around the table. It's predicated upon Occam's razor, the minimum. If you make an assumption, it doesn't go in.
Yes. Well, I agree with that, but that doesn't prevent misinformation from getting into Wikipedia if people are devious and it's not obvious what the goal is that they're trying to get. First, young lady.
Watched it sink into where you can't agree on the facts.
Yeah.
You can't agree on what is a legitimate source.
Right.
And if I, as an editor, said, well, that's not a good source, that's not factual, the response is generally, well, I don't think you don't agree with me.
Yeah. And that's not what facts are all about. They are independent of agreement or disagreement, right? They are what they are.
Yeah, I mean, no child left behind.
There's a lot of places to spread the blame, but no child left behind. Exactly. It ended up being a dumbing down process, unfortunately. Rick?
So how difficult was it to establish the Army and Navy about 9 to 12 months before the Constitution was signed?
Well, it was almost, if the United States, and there was a crisis that came up. We'll talk about it in the next session called Shays' Rebellion. And where farmers who were being taken badly in Massachusetts were being badly taken advantage of in the courts and losing their farms. Here you have Revolutionary War veterans. What else could you have asked from what they did with their service? And they started closing the courts down. So the governor of Massachusetts went to call out the militia, and he found out, A, he didn't have one, and B, he didn't have any money to have one. So now what does he do? And so that's when the alarm bells went off, and that dealing with it, so he basically, I think, paid for them out of his own pocket to form a militia to deal with these angry farmers. So, yeah, that was a very serious issue, and when they realized, hey, we're essentially defenseless. We don't like standing armies, but we need to have some sort of standing. And so that was one of the alarm bells that went off and was a major push behind the Constitutional Convention. Yes,
We have a captive audience here, so I'm going to address the issue of phones. The previous principal attempted to have phones not allowed at the high school. One parent, mother, came and said, well, how will I get a hold of my kid? We managed to do that quite well long before these phones. And these phones are affecting us all negatively. So my suggestion, you are at this meeting because you care, that you might want to come to a school board meeting and support no phones during the day at the high school. That will help our kids with learning. One of the schools that did this, the comment from the young girl was said, there's noise now, we're talking to each other in the hallway. They aren't talking to each other, sitting next to each other doing this. We're doing the same thing. This is not doing good things to our brains. So let's save our kids if we can't save ourselves. So I hope you will pay attention to school board meetings, write letters, call, show up at the meetings, so that we get educated kids who are going to be able to handle what's coming down the pipe. Because I'm really concerned about that. You know, Tom is too.
nonetheless, letting AI into the classroom.
Right.
So how do you know whether this paper written by the student is legitimate or illegitimate? And what tools do you have as a teacher to combat AI? Isn't all bad, but it's obviously, yeah, not all that cracked up with it either. Yeah, Bill,
Jonathan Haidt published a book called The Anxious Generation that deals with that.
Yeah. Another thing, if you're interested in knowing the next get together with this dear man is July 9th. I have a
July
list.
7th.
It's July 7th, but I got it wrong here too again.
Wait a minute.
It's
I'm
just
pretty
9:20.
I'm pretty sure it's.
Well, that's why I would love to have your email if you're interested in coming to the next one, which I think these are awesome.
July 7th.
July 7th. Okay,
For
so
sure.
wrong on-
Then we don't have one scheduled for August yet. Scheduled for September. Because they wouldn't let them. Huh?
How many are
And five total. So we will write the Constitution the next meeting. Then we will take a deep dive into the Constitution on the session after that. And then we will do the Bill of Rights as our last session. Yes,
Go ahead, yes.
You said there were 5 people who started these things. 2 of them I haven't heard of, Livingston and Sherman.
yes.
Could you
Oh, Roger Sherman is the only one of the founders that signed all of the foundational documents. So he's on something prior to the Declaration of Independence or something relatively, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. He was involved in all 4 of so he was from Connecticut. And he will play a huge role in the Constitutional Convention as a compromise. Because, they're fighting over how states are to be represented. And it's the Connecticut Compromise, he's from Connecticut, that proposed a Senate where states were represented equally and a House of Representatives where they were represented proportionally. And that all money bills had to start in the House so that the large states, being Virginia, Massachusetts was a large state, New York was a large state, all the rest of them were considered small states. So they were, James Madison, of course, is going to propose the outline that basically becomes the Constitution. But it favored Virginia at first. And so the small states had a knee-jerk, panicked reaction and basically created something that looked a whole lot like the current Articles of Confederation, except that they did have a head of state, 3 of them. So 3 presidents. And I used to say, well, be like George VIII, we gotta make sure here that we don't know, we just said, not gonna do it. Now, and Bill Clinton, well, I didn't have sex with that woman or that woman, but that woman maybe. And so I used to take the kids down there with Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So what if you had those three as your presidents at the same time? It would have been chaos. So and we'll talk about that because that was a legitimate proposal by the small states, led by New Jersey, by the way. With
Wow.
William Patterson. So there's a Patterson, New Jersey. William Patterson of New Jersey was the man that got them together quietly at the night after being astounded by what James Madison had proposed, and got them together and said, okay, we need a counter proposal.
What about Livingston?
Oh, Livingston, let me see. He was from New York. I'm trying to think. John Jay was the first. I'm trying to remember if he was on the Supreme Court at any point in time. I'll have to look him up. I'm pretty sure he's from New York, but I can't remember
It
precisely.
was New York. It said New York on your
Yeah.
slide. Yeah.
But I don't remember what he's famous for. Some of the founders, kind of run like there was a guy by the name of Luther Martin, not Martin Luther, Luther Martin, who was a habitual drunkard. And so some of his speeches went on for hours at the Constitutional Convention. So, and so other than that, he kind of flies below the radar screen. Or Dayton, I forget, was Robert Dayton, who would have been the youngest at the Constitutional Convention. So on the Maryland, I think it's the Maryland quarter, the state quarter, they had him on his horse. And so that's how he made, because he was an early signer, but also I think one of the first states that actually ratified.
How were they chosen? The delegate from each state? Did they volunteer or?
Well, George Washington was selected. They knew they couldn't succeed. He was
Without him.
cajoled, pushed. And they were elected in many cases. Mhm. From different districts
In those states?
in those states, right? And New York elected 3. Most of the time, only Alexander Hamilton was there. The other 2 got up. I think Livingston was one of those who left in anger and disgust, and left the whole state of New York in the hands of Alexander Hamilton,
Oh,
who of course signed off on it.
yeah.
Yes,
I'm curious about a little bit more about the issue of slavery. Was it just decided on economic basis, or did anybody argue in terms of morality?
they did not make, well, yes, there were delegates from Pennsylvania like James Wilson that did make arguments on morality. But the problem was, and they understood this, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia for sure would have walked out. And you probably wouldn't have had a constitution. They used all of, and in fact, a couple of their delegates worked at rewriting sections of the Constitution to kind of gloss over the fact. You'll notice if you can get an original copy of the Constitution, the word slave is not in it. They were persons held to property, persons held to, I forget what the exact wording is, or but they never, you know there's talking about slaves, but they never use the word slave or slavery.
So I thought,
Always, it would have torn the Constitutional Convention apart. And you stop and think, George Washington was a slave owner.
Mhm.
And he is the only one of the founding fathers that freed his slaves upon his death, but upon his death. And that didn't make them free because many of them were married to Martha Washington's slaves. So you would have torn if they actually got their freedom, it would tear the family apart. So in fact, not very many slaves were freed by George Washington's magnanimous gesture.
Hmm.
Yes, Bill.
Excuse me, say again the name of the fellow that came up with the House, the Senate,
Sherman, Roger Sherman. Yeah, from
I
Connecticut.
can march to the sea.
No, that's William Tecumseh Sherman, but, yeah, but no, he was very well known at the time, and he's one of the, like Sam Adams, you don't know much about Sam Adams because, and he resented that, by the way. He said, I played a big role in this and nobody knows who I am.
That was by design, right?
By his design,
By his design.
but he wasn't thinking of his legacy. He was thinking of making sure the British couldn't capture him, couldn't get
Take
it,
a lot,
couldn't
yeah.
figure out that he was the puppeteer behind a lot of this. Other questions? Well, thank you. Yes, sir.
When did the Supreme Court first come into being?
And when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, basically. Now, of the three branches, the judicial branch, the discussion of it in the is very short. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court has the right to declare laws unconstitutional. John Marshall grabbed it in the decision Marbury versus Madison. And Alexander Hamilton spoke about it in Federalist number 78, where who else would it make sense to have rule something unconstitutional but the judicial branch?
Right.
And so, knowing the Federalist Papers as he did, John Marshall used that logic. And he also didn't run around because he declared that Marbury was right. He deserved the position that John Adams had given him. But which would have made Jefferson very angry. But then he said, but the law that created that position was unconstitutional. So Marshall threaded the needle. He made Jefferson mad at him and he made Marbury mad at him. The case was Marbury versus Madison, but Madison was Secretary of State at that point. That's why he's listed in Marbury versus Madison. So Marshall threaded the needle and then built upon that idea in future decisions, building on the foundation that only the Supreme Court has the ability and authority to declare laws unconstitutional. Other than that, they weren't doing a whole lot for a while.
Okay, let's say thank you to this man. Next time is July 7th, right here. Last time I gave you instructions to bring somebody. So did anybody, who was here last time at the first one? And what was the homework? Shame on you. Let's bring somebody else. I think everybody needs to see this. We got to get the kids at the high school next fall listening to this dear man. This is awesome. So we'll see you in July.
Olivier.